go into observational learning and the connection to reinforcement. That'll take us into conditioning, and we'll compare and contrast those two. So we've got information processing coming in, and that was one part of learning. It was really the mechanical piece, right? Paying attention to information from the environment and then rehearsing it in short-term memory so that we can encode it into long-term memory. When we talk in terms of long-term memory, we're really talking about that cognitive domain of Bloom's if we want to make that connection. But let's also look at the affective domain that Bloom's mentioned, more of that behavioral piece. So what Bandura did was he took information processing theory, the beginning stage of that, attention, retention, reproduction, and he said you have to pay attention to stimulus coming in. You have to rehearse and encode in order to retain that information. In order to reproduce it and reproduce it correctly, we need practice and feedback. That's where feedback comes in as something that reinforces the correct process, especially if it's skill related. And then he tacked on motivation. And to keep the person motivated to put forth the effort, we can use reward and reinforcement. So let's go through and compare Bandura to behaviorists like Skinner or Pavlov. So individuals like that were behaviorists said, we have a stimulus that comes in from the environment, but what goes on internally cannot be studied. And so all we can really look at is their response, that behavioral response to that stimulus. But Bandura disagreed. He was trying to combine behaviorist with the cognitive model. He said, yes, you do have input that comes in from the environment. He agreed with that. He agreed with Pavlov and Skinner and even Miller that was an important element. But he said the mediational process during observational learning, we can study it. It's not a black box. We can look at a person's motivations for doing what it is they're doing. And we can also look at that output behavior as a response to it. So let's look at Bandura's model again. We have attention, so we have environmental stimulus coming in. We rehearse that information and encode it to retain it. We use practice and feedback to reproduce it correctly. And then we have reward and reinforcement to put forth the effort. And that's something we can study is somebody's effort, and that can be an estimate of their motivation. And you can also use qualitative surveys to estimate a person's motivation. We can look at the reasoning on why they did what they did. Then we have the connection between observational learning and experiential learning. So modeling is where individuals are observed, and then the individuals that are observed are the models, and somebody else is going to replicate that. Probably the best example of that would be Bandura's research on children. So he had an individual go into a room, and then they had a young child, around 2 years of age, watch that individual punch on an inflatable punching bag, one of those inflatable Bobo dolls. It's actually called the Bobo doll experiment. And so the adult punches on it. That adult leaves the room, and then the child enters the room. And they immediately replicate what they observed. So that's observational learning, but that is a form of experiential learning. They are learning from somebody else's experience. They're making observations of it, and they're forming their own experience. Now let's go into conditioning. And let's break up conditioning into operant conditioning versus classical conditioning. But before we do that, we really need to understand reinforcement versus punishment. When you're trying to distinguish between those two, you always want to look at the desired behavior. What are we trying to do with the behavior? If we're trying to increase or maintain a behavior, that's reinforcement. If we're trying to decrease a behavior, that's punishment. Let's use Skinner's rat experiment as an example of positive reinforcement versus negative reinforcement. So Skinner created a box. He put a rat inside this box, and he wanted that rat to pull a lever. But the rat doesn't know that. So we have to start off with involuntary behaviors that lead to voluntary behaviors. So if the rat didn't pull that lever, it's actually press the lever. If he didn't press the lever in a certain period of time, an electrical grid would shock his feet and it would jump around and accidentally bump up against the lever. But as soon as he exhibited that behavior, even though it was involuntary, that electric shock was removed. That's negative reinforcement. We're removing something that the rat does not like, so they'll continue to exhibit that behavior. So they'll either increase or maintain that behavior of pushing the lever. I know it sounds like punishment, but we're removing something adverse to get them to increase that behavior. Then the rat starts to pick up on that. Certain period of time, shock starts, he starts jumping around, bumps up against the lever again, and he starts to put two and two together and said, oh, you know what? If I press that lever before a certain period of time, the shock won't even start. And so starts pressing the lever. Well, if the rat presses that lever in a certain period of time, it gets fed. That's positive reinforcement. It gets something it desires to increase or maintain the behavior of pushing the lever. So he gets fed, he eats, and then he says, all right, starts to take that involuntary behavior and make it voluntary. He notices that as long as I press it in a certain period of time, not only does the shock never even start, but I'm getting fed. And eventually over time, they change that to variable interval reinforcement. So it has staying power. All right, let's look at positive punishment versus negative punishment. So we've moved away from reinforcement, which is we're trying to maintain or increase a behavior. Now let's look at trying to decrease a behavior. Let's say somebody does something we don't want them to do. We want to decrease that behavior. For me, growing up in the 70s and 80s, corporal punishment was still in school. So they would add something adverse, something you did not want, to stop you from doing something. So we would have to go to the office and get licks. Terrible example, but it actually happened. And I was in the office all the time. Then you have negative punishment. Think of today. Somebody did something we don't want them to do. Let's say it's a child, and they love playing video games, something that they desire. And we take that away from them to stop them from doing something. That's negative punishment. We're taking something away that's desired to stop them from doing whatever action they did. We don't want them to repeat it. Now let's roll down here to feedback, because that was an important element that we saw in the mediating process, not just reinforcement, but what is the role of feedback? And we'll use this in our activity. I want y'all to focus on the types of feedback I give and the influence it has on you learning something new. So with positive feedback, I might just give you praise, but there's no real descriptive example of what you did correctly. I'm just like, good job. That's okay. Some people like that. But if we're trying to improve something and get something correct, I kind of need something descriptive. So it's not as good as it could be. It makes somebody feel good, but it doesn't necessarily tell them what they did correctly or even what they did wrong. Let's say I'm a coach and I'm screaming at my players, you're doing a terrible job. That's negative feedback, but I'm not necessarily telling them what they did wrong. It has a place, but it's best if it's paired with something corrective. So let's look at corrective feedback. That can be both positive, negative, sandwich, whatever you want to use. Let's say somebody does something. I'm like, hey, great job. You did these elements correctly. Overall, man, that was a really good job. That's positive corrective. That's more of a sandwich method where I told them what they did well, but I sandwiched it between two positives. Negative feedback can be used the same way as long as you're giving negative corrective, right? terrible job. Quit running the route. You're supposed to run it this way. You went that way. Stop doing that. That would be the sandwich method of negative feedback. At least I told them what they were doing wrong. They're not going to feel good about it, and it's not going to be motivational. So it's okay to use both, but you want to make sure that you're providing some sort of corrective information so that they can change whatever it is they're doing wrong. And you also have motivational feedback. It tends to be what I described with the positive sandwich method. Hey, great job. You did this correctly. You need to change these things, but overall, great job, right? That's motivational. They're going to feel good about it. And you gave them something, not only that they did correctly, but something they could change. And so I want you to pay attention today in class, or when we get to this assignment. What type of feedback did I use, and did it influence your learning? So we've got cognitivists like Pavlov, Skinner. Then you've got Bandura, who took social learning theory to the next step by combining those two, behavioralism with cognitive approach, and he took the mediating process. But let's look real quick at the difference between Pavlov and Skinner's approach. So let's look at classical conditioning. You have Pavlov that conditioned a dog by pairing a bell with the dog being fed. It was involuntary, right? The dog would salivate at that bell alone. That was an involuntary response. Whereas Skinner used operant conditioning, both positive and negative reinforcement. It started off as involuntary, but it led to a voluntary response by the rat. The rat eventually became aware that if he pressed that lever in a certain period of time, not only would the shock stop, but he would get fed, as long as it was in that time interval. So that's the main difference that you'll see between Pavlov and Skinner. Pavlov is dealing with classical conditioning, creating an involuntary response, the dog salivating at the bell alone without it being paired to food. Yes, the food will cause salivation, but the dog started to pick up when that bell rang. It knew it was going to be fed, and eventually over time you could remove the food altogether and just ring the bell and the dog would start to salivate. But you can have what's called extinction. If I kept doing that and never paired it again with the food, if I rang the bell without pairing it, eventually the dog would stop salivation. But again, we're dealing with involuntary, whereas Skinner was looking to take involuntary to a voluntary response. And when you're dealing with humans, it's easier, it's faster to get to that voluntary response with operant conditioning. Here are your references. This is where I pulled the information from. McLeod is a great reference. This is on Bandura's SLT model, social learning theory, and more specifically, the mediating process. And here's some information on reinforcement versus punishment. That chart that I showed, that's where I got it from. And it's one of the best matrices, I think, on reinforcement versus punishment. That's a real easy one to get confused. And you're always thinking about, what am I trying to do with behavior? Am I trying to maintain it or increase it? Reinforcement. If I'm trying to decrease the behavior, that's punishment.